Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into a story of power, betrayal, and the dangerous game of thrones being played in West Africa. This is the true, chilling tale of how Ibrahim Traoré, a young, ambitious army captain, took down his own commander in a coup inside a coup, shocking the entire world. The night of September 30th, 2022, felt heavy. In Ouagadougou, the air was restless, thick with rumors, the smell of diesel from armored vehicles rolling through the streets. Soldiers checked every roadblock, scanning for threats, but the threat was already inside. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, only 34 years old, had spent weeks planning this night. Months earlier, a senior officer named Paul-Henri Damiba had seized power in his own coup, promising to restore security in Burkina Faso, a country torn apart by jihadist violence. But Damiba had failed, at least in Traoré's eyes. Attacks were multiplying. Villagers were being slaughtered. Weapons meant for soldiers never arrived at the front. Someone was stealing. Someone was lying, and Captain Traoré decided that person was Damiba. This wasn't just a political struggle. It was a war within the military itself, a high-stakes thriller where you trusted no one. Traoré's plan was simple but dangerous. Move fast, strike surgically, cut out the rot before it spread. He would overthrow the man who had just overthrown the last president. If he failed, he would die as a traitor. He picked the men carefully, soldiers who had fought beside him in Mali, soldiers who owed him their lives. These were not palace guards who only polished their boots. These were hardened men, used to sleeping in the dirt, men who had seen what terrorists did to villages when no one came to protect them. The assault began before dawn. Tactical teams secured the radio station, cutting off Damiba's voice from the airwaves. Another team moved on the presidential palace, a cold block of concrete and marble built for rulers who thought they'd live forever. The palace guards were stunned, overwhelmed by the speed and precision of Traoré's men. No one wanted a bloodbath, but blood was always a possibility. In the echoing hallways of power, the rule was simple: move fast, shoot if needed, and leave no loose ends. By sunrise, it was over. The national broadcast had changed hands. Traoré, in camouflage uniform, appeared on television with a calm, deadly voice. He declared that the previous coup leader, Damiba, had failed to protect the nation, and that he, Captain Traoré, would finish the job. The screen crackled with tension. You could almost hear millions of hearts stop across the country. It was the kind of moment that changes a nation forever. A coup inside a coup. A betrayal wrapped inside another betrayal. But to many ordinary Burkinabés, this was not shocking. The country had been living under a chain of broken promises for years. Presidents who stole, officers who lied, elections where ballots meant nothing. So the people flooded the streets, some cheering, some afraid, most simply exhausted. They had seen the cycle before. They knew revolutions could eat their own children. Yet something about Traoré felt different, at least that first morning. He was young, sharp, unpolished, uncorrupted, at least so far. He spoke of reclaiming Burkina Faso from a cancer of fear, a cancer fed by terrorists and corrupt officials alike. He was bold enough to break ranks, to turn on his own commander, and that alone gave people hope. But power, once seized, becomes a poison. Traoré was no fool. He knew enemies would be everywhere. The same men who had toasted his success last night could be plotting his downfall tomorrow. So he moved quickly to solidify his grip. He reshuffled the officer corps, sidelining anyone loyal to Damiba. He created new security units, recruiting soldiers from the poor countryside, men grateful for a job, loyal only to him. And he called on civilians to rise up as local militias, promising them weapons and protection if they would stand with him against terror. Behind the scenes, diplomats scrambled. The French embassy, once so powerful in Burkina Faso, watched in horror as Traoré's speeches turned against them. He blamed France for decades of manipulation, for training corrupt officers, for supporting puppet governments. He looked instead to Moscow, to Ankara, and even to rogue mercenaries who would offer him cheap drones and no lectures about democracy. Traoré had seen enough death to know that speeches would not save his country. Only raw power could do that. And if that meant breaking alliances, making new friends in dangerous places, so be it. Still, the terrorist threat refused to die. The very night after Traoré seized power, jihadist cells attacked a convoy in the north, killing over a dozen civilians. As he stood over their coffins a few days later, Traoré made a silent promise that he would crush these murderers at any cost. But each new promise carried its own shadow. You could see it in his eyes on television, that hard, distant stare of a man who was already losing sleep, already wondering who might stab him in the back next. Because in a power game like this, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The people of Burkina Faso, for a moment, chose to believe him, but they had chosen to believe so many before. And somewhere in the dusty alleys of Ouagadougou, a rumor was already growing. If Traoré could betray Damiba, could someone betray Traoré? The first days of Ibrahim Traoré's rule were a blur of military briefings, emergency meetings, and long nights where he barely slept. The adrenaline that had pushed him through the coup now gave way to a grinding fear. Everyone was watching him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. The soldiers who had cheered his boldness began demanding results. They wanted weapons, rations, pay. The civilians who had waved flags in the streets wanted immediate peace. The foreign diplomats wanted a roadmap to elections. All of these voices crashed into his mind at once, a storm of impossible expectations. Traoré responded the only way he knew how, with speed and force. He sent teams north to hunt jihadist groups, sometimes giving them near unlimited authority to do whatever it took. Drone strikes, village raids, mass sweeps. The message was clear: crush the terrorists no matter what. But the more aggressive the campaign became, the more the lines blurred. Innocent villagers were caught in the middle. Reports trickled back of forced conscriptions, of young men dragged from their homes at night to fight, whether they wanted to or not. Some cheered this as necessary sacrifice. Others saw it as the birth of a new tyranny. Meanwhile, Traoré moved to silence potential rivals. Officers who had seemed too close to Damiba were quietly retired or reassigned to meaningless posts. Journalists who asked too many questions were threatened. One radio station was shut down for spreading anti-patriotic lies. If there was a playbook for controlling a restless country, Traoré was reading straight from it. Yet to many Burkinabé, he was still a symbol of hope. He gave speeches that echoed Sankara, promising to reclaim national dignity, to break free of colonial chains, to build a nation for Burkinabé, by Burkinabé. In poor villages, people nodded with pride. They were tired of watching French soldiers patrol their streets and of politicians who did nothing but steal. Traoré's anger was their anger. But every night when he finally closed his eyes, Traoré felt the same dream, over and over, the ghost of Sankara standing before him, silent, unblinking, as if to ask, "And what will you do differently?" His war cabinet started planning alliances no one could have imagined before. Contacts were opened with Russian military advisors, with Turkish drone manufacturers, and even with mercenary networks that had no moral code at all. The calculation was brutal. Better to be feared than to be abandoned. By the first anniversary of his coup, the country was still under siege. Terrorist attacks had not stopped. They had only shifted, targeting softer, unprotected villages, punishing Traoré's supporters whenever they could. These ruthless strikes were meant to break faith in him, to show that no leader could protect them. Traoré refused to budge. He doubled down, declaring on state television, "We will not hold elections until this cancer is destroyed." Foreign journalists gasped. International NGOs condemned him. But he would not bend. His soldiers, however, grew tired. They had been fighting without proper pay, without enough ammunition, in an endless cycle of raids and counter-raids. The men who once pledged loyalty began to murmur. "He talks like Sankara, but fights like any other dictator," they whispered. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré's circle shrank. Paranoia poisoned every meeting. Who could he trust? Even his oldest comrades looked different now, eyes darting sideways, hands resting on their sidearms. One night, after hearing reports of another massacre in the north, Traoré slammed his fist against his office table, breaking a delicate glass ornament. "How do you lead people who no longer believe anything?" he growled. It was a question without an answer. Burkina Faso had fallen into a cycle of power struggles for decades, and Traoré had stepped right into its jaws. His rise had been breathtaking, a coup within a coup, a young man with a dream. But the machine of violence, corruption, and revenge was stronger than any single captain. The people had hoped for a hero. Some still did, but others saw a man who might become exactly what he'd sworn to destroy. And in the dusty markets of Ouagadougou, a new rumor took hold. A rumor that maybe, just maybe, someone else was already plotting the next coup. Because in Burkina Faso, power never sleeps, and those who hold it can never sleep either.